All right, this is lecture number 9, and we're still in Unit 3, and the heading is Development and the Triumph of Theology. The key word here, I think, is triumph of theology. And I'm going to stress right from the beginning the conundrum between philosophy and revelation. So this is really what we're talking about. It's not a new subject because we have covered some things before. This lecture is going to be a long one, and you might want to cut it up into 2 parts. There will be some repetition, but I think that it's an enjoyable subject. In other words, because as we talk now specifically of certain people, we will find it interesting to look at them, what influence they've had. Some more, some less. I can't be totally positive that some of my pronunciation is right on some of these Arabic names, but I will do my best, and we'll work through this. I'm sure that you will find it interesting. We will be also reminding you that there has been quite a bit of influence here from, Christian influence. There was some debates as well. One sometimes wonders how Christian they were because of their dependence on philosophy. But there was this interaction. In other words, during the Abbasid Caliphate, there was a certain growth in the Islamic schools. And so these Muslims do come in contact with these philosophers, Western philosophers, and there's an influence there on them. Let's talk about the major contributors to philosophy, theology, and mysticism. There is we're looking at a mix. We're looking at some who, depend heavily on Aristotle and Plato, others reject it. Some are Sufis, some are modernists, some are fundamentalists. And we will see these shifts in the whole, shifts in Islam, or shifts in what's accepted as right and true, particularly under the influence of Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111. Again, we'll say, to the danger of always repeating it, is the relationship, that is the war between theology and philosophy. We're not going to cover everything. This, for instance, this Wahhabi movement, we're not going to spend any time looking at that, but we'll try to cover the main ones. And the first fellow that we look at is Al-Kindi, who died in 866. In some cases here, I'm going to shorten as much as I can the information, but it's not going to be totally brief on most of them. But I just say that there is another Al-Kindi, much less influential, who was a Christian, an Arab Christian, who wrote a tract called the Apology of Al-Kindi. So let's keep in mind that there are 2 Al-Kindis. This is the big one. His full name is Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq Al-Kindi. These Arabs always have these long names. He wrote a total of 242 books on logic, math, spheres, music, and metaphysics. One book, the main one, was called The Exhortation to Study Philosophy. This fellow is very committed to philosophy, and he relied heavily on Aristotle. In fact, he said that such study can help you to better understand the prophet. It's quite interesting that this fellow was a little bit mystical as well. In other words, remember we talked about ta'wil, which was the hidden meaning in a passage of the Quran, as opposed to that which was very, very apparent in a tanzil, meaning that that which comes down and his exterior. But this fellow said that if anything is hard to understand, we will fall back on the Tawil, which is only known to God. He was, in some sense, a Mutazilite. He had sympathies in that area. He has been called the philosopher of the Arabs, and he does give some allegorical interpretation to the Quran, and tries to get around some of the illogical thinking. Much could be said about him, but he's the first important philosopher of Islam. In other words, the person who relied heavily on Aristotle and Plato. Ibn Hanbal, who died in 855, his full name was Ahmad ibn Hanbal, started the Hanbali school, which we've talked about before. He had a lot to do with the Hadith. And when a caliph sort of made the Mutazilite doctrine the orthodox doctrine, or said this is really the truth, Hanbal strongly resisted it and fiercely opposed it. And Hanbal said the Quran is eternal. He refused to back down on this issue. The Quran is eternal, and so he was, in other words, I wouldn't call him stubborn, but he certainly did stick to his guns. Very traditional in his thinking. Next is Al-Ashri, who died in 935. We can hear about him and talk about him from Fakhri, page 64, and also Glacé. His full name was Abu Hassan Ali ibn Ismail al-Ashri. He was the founder of a movement spoken about, and strangely enough, and this is really something that's interesting, is that he had been a Mutazilite up until that time. And then he stands up in the mosque, in Basra Mosque, and he recants. He says that he's been mistaken all his life, and he's going to turn from Mutazilite, and he's going to become a hardliner. He has had a dream. He had a dream of Muhammad, apparently, and so he emphasizes that human beings, individuals, are not free agents. He said that's polytheism. So he changed and from what he was, and he said that, anybody who believes in that free agent business has had something to do with the Manichaeans. He said God's power is absolute. So this fellow is the founder of Sunni Kalam, that is theology. He founds, of course, the Asherites, emphasizes predestination. Another is Al-Farabi, died in 950. Fakhri also talks about him. He has been called the second teacher after Aristotle, so you can see his influence and the way that he deals with things. He is Turkish. He had studied in Baghdad. He'd gone to Syria, Egypt, and he died in Damascus. He drew quite a bit from Neoplatonism, and he talked a lot about Plato. He depended on Plato and Aristotle, and he said that revelation is subordinate to reason. Now listen to this. He is the first truly systematic philosopher in Islam. Now we come to Ibn Sina, who died in 1037. His full name is Abu Ali Hussein ibn Abd Allah ibn Sina, and he's also called Avicenna, or the Prince of the Learned. This guy is really the pride of the Persians. He was the prince of the physicians. He became a prime target for Al-Ghazali when Al-Ghazali made this attack on philosophers. Ibn Sina was the one who really got hit with that. But Avicenna is a fantastic fellow. He's a physician, a philosopher. He's a renowned scholar in the Middle Ages. He owes a great debt to Al-Farabi, but his writings are far ahead of of Farabi, sort of the idea that the student becomes greater than the teacher. At age 16, he is teaching other doctors all about medicine. He contributes to metaphysics. He is like Al-Farabi, and that he talks about the emanation from necessary being, but revelation is subordinate to reason. Again, see, this is where this guy's coming from. You can't help but be impressed by these Muslims and their contributions. In other words, their brilliance, their scholarly work. That's important to note, because today a lot of people don't realize that the Muslims had said some great thinkers. Now, Al-Ghazali. This guy gets the lion's share of attention. Another one that does in this lecture is Sayyid Qutb. But Al-Ghazali dies in 1111. His full name is Abu Hamid Muhammad Al-Ghazali. He is a man who wears many hats, sort of a jack of all trades. We can call him the greatest theologian in the history of Islam. He seemed to be somewhat skeptical in the beginning, but then later on in his life he turns to Sufi stuff. That's what we mean by wearing many hats. He is, as Al-Ghazali carries on, and by the time we're finished with him, we see that the struggle between revelation and rationalism is coming to a head. He will show that metaphysics is hostile to Islam, and that you cannot rely on reason. You cannot question Islam. And so Al-Ghazali, the greatest Muslim theologian in history, is going to bring about some changes. One of his works is called Tahafut al-Falsafa, the incoherence of philosophy. So he refutes Aristotelianism, Neoplatonism, as interpreted by Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. He is a very, very influential guy. He wrote the book, his most famous book was The Revival of the Religious Sciences, Ilha Ulam al-Din. He turned to Sufism, so that too is something about Al-Ghazali. He said that I arrived at truth not by systematic reasoning and accumulation of proofs, by a flash of light which God sent into my soul. Isn't that interesting? He wrote a lot of stuff, yet he was influenced by the Greek dialectics. He maintained that exoteric need of law and theology to make knowledge complete. But, excuse me, he was certainly Sufi-ish in many of his ideas. He wedded, really, orthodoxy with Sufism, because before him, Sufism had gone underground. Remember the story of Al-Hallaj, who was crucified for the extremism that he went to. Al-Ghazali now helps to get them together as friends again. So a very influential fellow he is. Ibn Rushd, who died in 1198, his full name is Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Muhammad. He's born in Cordova. See, he's born right in Spain. And he is a philosopher. His other name, in Europe, he's known as Averroes, or Averroes. I'm sorry, I'm probably mutilating the pronunciation of that fellow's name. But he had a lot of influence. He confronts Al-Ghazali head-on for attacking philosophy, and he talks about two truths, one for philosophers and one for the masses. And he wrote directly against Al-Ghazali. He felt that religion and philosophy can get along. In other words, they're not enemies. Interesting fellow. Now, Ibn Arabi, who died in 1240, also has a long name. He is born in Spain, and when he is in Spain, this fellow is influenced by a couple of women who influence him in the area of mysticism. And at times, this fellow, who is a Sufi, if there ever was one, at times he almost seems to be pantheistic. Because he talks a lot about, he's open to everything, open to all forms. And he says that mine is the religion of love. Doesn't that sound like a Sufi? He is the most eloquent expression of mystical experience and of Islam as mystical. A bit pantheistic, sort of a overblown Sufi, like Maulana Jalal ad-Din Rumi, who died in 1273 and who was the founder of the Whirling Dervishes. These are all very, very important men that we're talking about here. And here is, of course, there are other ones that we, before we go on to someone else, I just wanted to mention other Sufi ascetics, including Al-Basri, Rabia al-Adawiyya, or some others as well. So there are lots of Sufis. I just throw them in there for the fun of it. Now let's go on to Ibn Khaldun, who died in 1406. He's often called the father of historiography, born in Tunisia, and wrote this quite famous book called Muqaddimiyah, or the Prologamiyah. He is an acute observer of human nature, has been called the father of sociology. He looked at sleep. He looked at dreams, interpretation of dreams. He's known for the Islamic philosophy of history, but also for having one hand in Sufism. This is Ibn Khaldun. And now Ibn Taymiyyah, death 1328. Definitely a hardliner. He's born in Damascus, member of the Hanbali school. That tells you a lot. He's imprisoned for his rigidity, but believes in the literal interpretation of the Quran, and he fought against the tasbih, the thing they hang around their necks, the beads. He opposed shrines. He is a Puritan. He's an absolutist. He's a literalist in his understanding of the Quran, and he attacks Al-Ghazali, the Sufi. He storms against bid'ah, or the innovation in religious practice. Storms against the Kharijites, against the Shiites, against the Murjites and the Mu'tazilites, even the Asharites. See how hardliner he is, storming against everyone. He says, I've examined all theological methods and found them incapable of curing any ill or quenching any thirst. Yet this fellow, despite his rigidity and purism, when he died, apparently 20,000 mourners followed his bier. Many women, for some reason, looked on him as a bit of a saint. He is a literalist, strong attacks on philosophy, and a sort of a favorite. Let's keep this in mind. He's a favorite of fundamentalists today. Basically said that the mind cannot comprehend truth. Certainly a Puritan of Puritans. Well, what about Al-Razi? Death 1209. He did a commentary, of course, on the Quran. If you're worth anything in Islam, you have to do this. He challenged Ibn Taymiyyah. Probably the most important one to do so. He was a moderate and a bit of a radical one at that. He was a Platonist. He said he hardly sees any conflict between philosophy and theology. He's willing to combine them. In other words, he's not one of these guys who is so narrow and rigid. Al-Ghafani, we won't talk much about him other than the fact that he was a modernist as well. His full name, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. He was born in Iran but raised in Afghanistan, and he would hold, in other words, would place the modernist and the fundamentalist side by side. There's lots of other things that you could say about him, but let's move on to Muhammad Iqbal, death 1938. Remember, the father of Pakistan. He said that the Quranic interpretation by the four schools was not set in stone. Remember that this fellow got his PhD in Munich, and so he knows the West. He's got his training there as well. He said that there is no finality in Islamic law. The teaching of the Quran, life is a process of progressive creation, necessitates that each generation, guided but uninhabited by the work of its predecessors, should be permitted to solve its own problems. See? He was reluctant, as I want you to take note of the validity of the Hadith as one of the sources of Islamic law. He said that the Islamic scholar Abu Hanifa had not used the Hadith. His views on ijma were probably what made the ulama the most angry, because he said that when we do ijma, he said we should enlarge the scope. In other words, he talked about a legislative assembly similar to Turkey and Egypt, where the practice of ijma is not limited, listen to this, to scholars of Islamic law. It extends to the masses. He said that ijma has, and it's true that ijma has been a bone of contention between moderates and conservatives in Pakistan. That's Muhammad Iqbal, who was known as the philosopher of the East, he was one who wanted to open the door up. In other words, he believed in openness and freedom. But let's keep in mind that though Muhammad Iqbal sounded democratic, he never endorsed the democracy as practiced in the East. He said democracy is a system where people are counted but not weighed. This is what he said. The democratic system of the West is the same old instrument whose chords contain no note other than the voice of the Kaiser, the demon of despotism, in dancing in his democratic robes. Yet you consider him to be the nylon theory of liberty. So he's critical, you see, of the West, Western culture, philosophy, and ideology. He felt that its secularism was morally bankrupt, its colonialism imperialistic, and its capitalism a means of exploitation. Iqbal talks about qiyas, the final source of Islamic law. Remember, there are four sources. And he said that, if you really understand it, it was even practiced during the time of the Prophet. He said Abu Hanifa had pointed out and emphasized at his college in Aligarh. So that is Muhammad Iqbal, very important fellow, and one that I particularly like to talk about. Muhammad Abdu died in 1905. He sounds like a Mutazilite. His disciple was Muhammad Rashid Rida, who died in 1935. This guy here is from Egypt, and he was one who modernized Al-Azhar in Cairo. Now, here's another interesting fellow. They're all interesting, but I have my favorites, I guess. Hassan al-Banna died in 1948. He was the one who established the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood. And he comes from Egypt, which is called the cradle of Islamic fundamentalism. In 1928, he started the Muslim Brotherhood. And, it was sort of like, it seemed that the MB was suited to the Middle Eastern Arabs. This became very, very powerful in Egypt. It has been stamped on and crushed by the Egyptian government, but right today, if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood, they seem to be much more liberal. In other words, they're not as hard-line as they used to be. At least that's what it looks like. He contributed to fundamentalism a great deal. He was reacted against Western secularism and what he called the detriment to the moral society of Islam. He wanted people to return to the Quran and the Sunnah. He said Islam alone is complete and inclusive, that all society should come under his Muslim fundamentalist dictates. You know, this guy has had tremendous influence. He advocated reopening the gates of ijtihad, and he criticized the ulama for their stagnant approach to Quranic exegesis. You know, Islam is complicated. Islam has gone through a lot of turmoil, and Muslims have thought about a lot of stuff. I can't help but think when I look at guys like Hassan al-Banna, and even more so when we get down to Qutb, how that colonialism spurred them on. They felt that somehow, getting back to Islam will help us to get rid of the colonial powers and the Western, influence. Now, Sayyid Abul Ala Maududi, 1903 to 1979. He did a major commentary, as we might expect, on the Quran. What al-Banna was to the Arab world, Maududi was to the Indian subcontinent. He's known as the South Asian architect of Islamic fundamentalism. He's born into a Muslim Indian family of the Orthodox Sunni sect, but he only had 3 years of formal schooling in a madrasa, but he acquired most of his learning from home. His father taught him the rudiments of history and the principles of Islam, Urdu, Arabic, Persian in depth. He must have been quite a promising boy. And then in 1933, Maulana Maududi felt that his divine purpose, another purpose of his life, was to begin a commentary on the Quran, Tarjaman al-Quran, commentary of the Quran, and that he kept up doing until his death in 1979, and he has left us with a 6-volume commentary of the Quran. But he wasn't just known for scholarship. In Pakistan, he towers above all other religious leaders for his deep commitment to writing and speaking as a visible and popular exponent of Islamic issues outside the country as well. He wrote about 120 books, most of them in Urdu, but they have been translated into other languages as well. He says that, Islam, to be a Muslim means this and this and this. That was really what he wanted to accomplish, to define what it means to be a Muslim. His mission was to bring Islam as a total way of life. Certainly that's what he tried to do. And then he formed, as we've talked about before, the Jamaat Islamic, the J.I., Jamaat, the Party of Islam in 1941. In other words, to bring the pressure, ideological pressure on Muslim society. The party was deeply rooted in Islamic fundamentals, but it was structured according to the Western models of communism and fascism. How so? In that it was small organization, but highly motivated people, oftentimes young people, just like the communists have done. Keep it small and well organized, and ask for total commitment. He wanted to reform Islam from the inside out. He spoke of a jihad as the 6th pillar to, in other words, bring about social and political action to establish Muslim rule. We're not talking about militant, taking up the sword and stuff like that, but we're talking about this aggressive activity. This is Maulana Maududi. Now, that said, Maulana Maududi was naive in that it's almost like he had his head in the sky. And when people ask him, okay, well, now, all this that you're talking about, who will have the power? Well, he says, God. God is sovereign. And so, when the critics saw the possibility of tyranny, He said, you guys, you just don't understand Islam. God is in control. He doesn't somehow see that that is a possible door to tyranny. And so he is narrow, he's inflexible. And if you look at the history of Islam, let's to here Pakistan, since 1947, I think a lot of the blame can be laid on Maududi for he just wasn't a practical guy. Now, Sayyid Qutb, death, 1966. This is another fellow who is very, very interesting. He has been called the martyr of ideologue and theoretician of Islamic fundamentalism. Why? Because of his suffering, because of his radical thinking, and because of his total faith in Islam. And yet today, Sayyid Qutb is highly respected by Muslims, many Muslims. He was born in 1906 in Egypt. He was from a well-to-do family, respected member of the community. He was a timid fellow in many ways. He was sensitive, but very, very intelligent. By the time he's 10 years old, he's memorized the Quran. And he, later on in life, he totally dedicates his life to Islam. I can't help but respect these fellows who are so committed to what they believe. At 13, he goes to school in Cairo for schooling, and he graduates from Darul Ulam, House of Knowledge, and he, quite early in life, becomes aware of the westernizing tendencies of many Egyptians. Basically, three things that he is noted for. I already mentioned a couple of them. He's a theoretician. In other words, he brings some really good theory to the Muslim Brotherhood. He has a strong influence on the redirection of Islamic ideology. He's a strong member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so you see he's very, very active. He's sort of like Maududi in his literary achievements. He writes a total of 24 books, and some of them have been translated into English. And he has been quite popular with black Muslims in the United States. Again, like Maududi, he believes in Quranic literalism. He did a 30-volume commentary on the Quran, which is sort of known for its homiletical content, simplicity of style, and clarity of thought, and that has sold thousands and thousands and thousands of copies. Sayyid Qutb comes to the United States in 1949 as an exchange student, and we could talk a lot about that. Just let me say that it was not a happy experience for him. One thing is, the fellow is sort of dark, and that is a strike against him when he's here in the States. And he's also offended that the United States, people in the States, are so favoring of Israel. In other words, he senses that they don't like the Palestinians. He feels displaced. And, of course, we know that the United States was the first country to recognize the state of Israel. As he goes along, Sayyid Qutb more and more turns against Christians and Jews because he looks at them as synonymous with the West. Obviously, he didn't get a full picture, but this was his perception. And if you look at his journey, he turns from reformer to radical. After coming back from the States to Egypt, he joins the Muslim Brotherhood, and he gets more and more radical, and he's eventually arrested, and he's put in prison by Nasser because he tried to assassinate Abdul Nasser. He's given 15 years hard labor. When he comes out of prison, he is a very hard and brutal man who feels that the only way out of this, the only thing we can do is turn to violence and declare jihad against anybody who opposes us. He wrote this book, Malam fi al-Tariq, The Milestones, and as soon as that book becomes known, that publication, Qutb is executed in 1966. A very sad ending of a man. And it's true that prison can harden you. By persecuting him and torturing him, the Egyptian government really made him more of a martyr and turned him, made an enemy out of him more than ever before. Right, let's go to Ahmed Pervez, and we're almost finished. This is the last fellow, Ghulam Ahmed Pervez, 1903 to 1985. He has been called the second most important thinker after Maududi. Now, I don't think that's true. I think there's somebody else, Fazlur Rahman, whose text we have been using, would be far more qualified to have the second most important thinker. Certainly, Fazlur Rahman is the most important Muslim thinker of the 20th century. But this guy here is a civil servant. He gave weekly addresses in Lahore, on a variety of issues. He founded the Tuli Islam Center, an organization that published and distributed his writings throughout Pakistan. He makes a lot of fun of the Puritists, extreme Puritanism. And this is just an example of something he wrote showing how he mocks them. He says the preacher, he's talking about this mullah, the preacher is discoursing on the great blessings which will come to those who perform the prayers, and on the night of Shab-e Barak, in other words, this Eid holiday. And he says, with tears in his eyes, the Maulana proclaimed the greatness of the divine mercy that is open to all. The only ones excluded are those who allowed their trousers to cover their ankles. You see, this is Ahmed Pervez making fun of these guys for their narrowness and rigidity of viewpoint.